or so. But I know we've been communicating, and Marie reached out to you yesterday, and we'll continue to reach out to you in the coming days, if not week, about internship opportunities, and for you seniors, the other opportunities we've been talking about, as well as the mentorship and the placements that we'll be letting you know about in the coming weeks. So, but today we're really here to hear from Virgil and Virgil's friend Samuel Ross. And the theme is building your brand DNA. So I want to turn this over to Virgil and to Samuel, who I think you know is the founder of menswear brand Cold Wall, and was named in 2018 for the British Fashion Awards emerging menswear designer. So Samuel, so happy that you're here today. And Virgil, I'm gonna just turn it over to the two of you to start the conversation.
Yeah, no, thanks for having us. And it's good to link back up with all of you, the participants of the project. Today, I'm excited by introducing my colleague and friend Samuel Ross, but giving the main premise about like how serious and how almost like this is the yin to the yang to both of our practices, is like the ideology around it, but also mentoring and fostering Black students, to sort of ascend to the positions that we are, Samuel emanating out of the UK system, but subverting it and making his own path, me, the American system. So today, I'm excited to sort of introduce him and his practice and sort of let him have the floor as we sort of exchange. And I want this to be, the new face of mentoring in fashion. We hear that word like a lot. Everyone says that they're doing something, but those of you that know me and Samuel's work, it's like we put the ideas to the pavement and really want to nudge the ball forward. So like these are sort of postmodern sessions. They're not, just regular mentorship sessions. So with that said, Peter, do you want to start with some sort of like opening premise things, and then I'll let Samuel take the lead and I'll bounce off that?
Sure. I mean, I think, as the theme really is, and it applies to both of you, obviously, building your brand DNA, but really touching on your personal ideologies, and maybe giving some advice, but probably some relatable stories about how you both branded yourselves and your ideas, and maybe throughout that, Samuel and Virgil, a little bit about how you two came together and how you worked together. I think starting that way about maybe just how you even met is a good way to kick it off.
Yeah, Samuel, you take it.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, the first thing I have to say is, I'm super glad to be here and I appreciate everyone's time. So, Alyssa, Peter, Virgil, thanks for having me here. And again, really looking forward to just kind of sharing some of this discourse and sharing really just about how we went about, you could kind of say, etching out a new pathway in fashion, which is maybe a little bit more non-linear. And so the first thing to kind of talk about is how one goes about identifying spaces within the fashion industry which are maybe uninhibited is probably the first place I'd go. And I'm very much aware that a lot of people here are looking to kind of start their own, brands and narratives and projects, of course, once they finish the scholarship course. And I would say that, Virgil touched on the notion of myself looking at the British system and identifying what maybe hadn't been, you could say, articulated through a modern lens from a fashion perspective, similar to how Virgil was able to kind of course, before me, mirror that type of experience in the North American market space, you could say, looking at Renaissance artworks and this idea of, Renaissance artworks and high fashion overlapping to produce a new vernacular was similar to what I was able to kind of identify within the British working class system. And to kind of summarize that up, it's more so about how do you identify where there are gaps within the industry and marketplace which are culturally significant, which aren't being spoken about. And for me, it was less about trying to find an area of fashion to say latch onto or to, you could almost say regurgitate. And it was more so about finding a lived experience that I'd been through and finding a way to add that into the vessel of the fashion industry versus replicating a particular story or narrative in place. And for me, that came down to identity politics. It came down to, social circumstances, social sciences, anthropology, and finding out how there were, deep underlying conversations and tensions that were happening culturally throughout working class England that needed to be articulated in the fashion context, as it being, the main vessel, you could say, of the zeitgeist and of identity politics. This really comes down to trying to find a personal narrative that can be applied to then amplify almost the authenticity of what you bring forward through your work is what I just add there.
Yeah. And if you like, it's so good to see from the British perspective how you formulate. That's the one thing I didn't learn about fashion industry, especially coming from America, is you think about America, like obviously you're thinking about how to get your brand maybe on the pages of Vogue, or get your brand sort of on Instagram with celebrities, or gain traction. But it's important when Samuel's explaining his practice, like Britain has a different sort of social makeup, right? Being Black in Britain is different than being Black in America. There's a different, and he says like identity politics and sort of standing out. And I always think what's great about being global is you can learn how other societies view race or politics, or not even just sort of heavy stuff, just express themselves. And that's all in the brand DNA, so it's very, I met Samuel like on Instagram early. I was doing all my work by myself. And I was like, he's very much the very first instance of me sort of working with anyone outside myself. I was like, hey, I'm ascending. I know my trajectory, but it's like, what good is it if I'm just ascending by myself?
Yeah.
There needs to be a community. And this was early days, maybe, 7 years ago or something like that.
Yeah, we're talking 7 or 8 years ago now. And I think that's one thing that probably helped catch your attention was the fact that although we operate in this non-linear way, which kind of breaks all the rules in terms of, velocity of ascension and the fields in which we operate within, we both come from quite traditional backgrounds. And it was, how do you kind of propagate, that reality of coming from a traditional institutional background in design, in fashion, and in art, and then applying a new texture and slant on top of that, you could say institutional background, which can give you could say more of a serrated edge in the marketplace. And I think that's where this idea of mixing, the cutting edge, the bleeding edge of contemporary culture, and pairing that with the intelligence that you accrue through education is where you can kind of find a new cadence and a new rhythm to move your career forward in. Having worked at, previous advertising agencies, industrial design companies and agencies, you quickly learn that they can be quite conservative and quite rigid in their way of thinking. And it's your job as, all of you as scholars, as the next generation, to actually break that way of thinking and start to remold what it means to be a fashion designer or a creative director for the next gen. And what Virgil probably saw were elements of a new type of atypical language coming forth that he was, of course, already magnifying. It was more so I was identifying with that way of communication and identifying that there was a shift happening at that time. And as scholars, all of you have the capability and capacity to actually bring forward a new shift and a new slant to our industry. And that's what's really going to help. You could kind of say, not just accelerate, because it's not really about the acceleration. It's more so about the slant of new ideation coming forth. What people don't want to see is the safe option. People want to see the introspective, atypical, non-linear option, and that's what really changes things at a quicker pace, you could say.
And that's like, and just as for you guys, like the title of the talk is like building your brand sort of equity in your DNA. There's one of the first jewels, the things to take down notes of this talk is finding an inefficiency in the system.
Mm.
That's the door to walk through. You know, a lot of people ask, like, how do I do it? Like, how do I make a name for myself? How do I grow my brand? And it's a little bit like you're asking for the right steps to sort of like get popping. You know, like that's the underlying thing. Like, how can it make you more money, or how can you get more famous? Even if fame isn't your thing, you want to get traction. And what Samuel and I in our speak are saying, it's like, that's not the door. You know, like people often fall down that, like, hey, I want to be a designer. I want this to be my main job. I want to like stop working where I'm at, and etc. Finding inefficiencies in the landscape is what Samuel and I did. We were both like, hey, you know, for this like hyper intellectualized style of fashion design, you know, it's not even fashion that we're doing. On his Instagram, when I found him, I remember like, you need to actually pull this back up because I cite it all the time. He had like a yellow website with all black graphics on it that had skill set in everything else but fashion. And that's exactly what was on that website of your, and was that your portfolio?
Yeah, that was I had like 4 different aliases. So I was trying to almost be risk averse in how I presented myself as a creative director, filmmaker, streetwear artist, you know, graffiti artist simultaneously. And this website was almost like a hub to hold all of those proxy websites. It was bright yellow. It had, you know, Bauhaus, post-World War II industrial, sans serif graphics in the top left corner. But what really struck on the page was it was mixed media, you could say. I kind of taught myself Photoshop, Illustrator, everything on top of that, from Premiere Pro, After Effects, Adobe Dreamweaver. This idea of being a multi-hyphenate was something that allowed me to move my career through the door quite quickly. And especially with working with Virgil as, you know, the only assistant at that time, having a wider array of skills, all relevant to creative direction and all relevant to fashion, allowed us to produce more work at a higher velocity and frequency with less resources, because we had a wider skill set at play.
Yeah, and so like, it's, if you're looking for, it's first is build community. So find an assistant. That's the second note. You know, like, of course, you might not have money to pay them, but there's always someone who wants to be a part of the vision. Like I said, I couldn't do the early days of my brand wouldn't have been strong if I didn't have someone to bounce it back and forth. And like, we didn't even meet in person. We were just digital.
Yeah, for like a year, we didn't actually meet. So the circumstance a lot of you guys are going into, you know, graduating and then you can't physically be in the office. Trust me, we've been there. We know exactly what that feels like. And that's how we kind of started. And actually, it's a really interesting place and circumstance to be in, because it gives you a lot more ebb and flow with how you manage your time. In fact, if you're localized to one place in a decentralized office, you've got more time to just focus on producing that work. But also another point I'd say is, you know, when I did start working with Virgil at first, it was identifying on my side, where are there gray areas where I can actually help? Versus kind of take and pull time away when you're going into a role of assisting someone you respect, you want to work with, or a company. You need to find these pockets and areas which are actually not covered within that infrastructure, so you can help and actually build in a value by being present, by just assisting the work. The other thing I'd also say is learn how to you know, self-manage yourself. You know, you want to be able to aid and assist the people that you're working with throughout your, you know, your first few years. And that means being as self-sufficient as possible, but also as reliable as possible. You know, there's no, the elasticity of the role is almost like the silver lining of it. You want to be able to not just cover and go in and expect to design, but you want to be able to help on every single level. If that means, you know, collating zip files, that's also a really relevant part of the process, and understanding the different dynamics to actually running and building a team, division, and company. You know, it's not just about the designing, it's about the process and automation as well.
Yeah, and so as you guys, you know, as you guys fill in these roles that you'll go into, you know, working within these spaces, it's about like sinking your teeth in to that ecosystem. So it takes, first you have to observe, you know, like each company will be different. observe how they work, observe where the ideas come from, observe who pitches the ideas, observe the inefficient part. Like, you know, maybe you're sitting there, even though that you might be the youngest person in the room, your asset is you might see what the older generation is missing, you know, and that's the inefficiency door that both Samuel and I occupied. Like in our own space, like we're still doing that to this day, like understanding that the fashion, if you look at the calendar in the UK, Samuel occupies a space that not many other designers can say they occupy. And even me, between you know, Paris and Milan, or just my figure, you know, how I exist, I'm very much just telling a story in a space that's very very wide. That's the inefficiency part. Peter, you want to go into the next bullet point so we don't?
Yeah, no, I mean, I wanted to hear maybe a little more specifically. You just touched on the inefficiency or the opportunity that you both found and how you solved for it. I mean, you're talking a little bit about schedule and when and how you show, but anything more you wanted to add, Samuel, about, you know, when Virgil talks about an inefficiency that you identify, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think, you know, a massive part of this is there's almost a bit of a facade sometimes of thinking, you know, as Virgil kind of touched on earlier, I want to join fashion, and there's a creative spirit or phoenix that kind of flows out of your body, but actually it's more so about being pragmatic. And there's an inefficiency within, you know, the industry on the creative front of pragmatism and understanding, you know, how to commercialize creativity is a huge part of this. Looking into, you know, merchandising, you know, target RRPs, cost prices, supply chain, all of these elements, if you can crack those quite early on, if you can make those, you know, strong points of your practice as a fashion designer, it will allow you to almost, you know, skip forward a lot quicker, because these are elements. As soon as you start selling, after year 1 to year 2, you're going to be selling a couple thousand orders a season. You're going to need to start thinking about supply chain, distributors, you know, cash flow. If you can start building these elements into, you know, the very start of your practice, or considering them, or spending just as much time on the creative as you are on the commercial, it can help you avoid inefficiencies which can kind of hit you later on, actually.
Yeah.
And there are practical ways to get around that as well, and to consider it. For example, the first 6 months of trading with a cold wall, I held no stock. So everything was made to order, which allowed me to not go into any type of, you know, financial debt or woes based off not misstepping on what I assumed people would buy. For example, we put up like a hat, an overcoat, and a tote bag online. If we only sold, you know, one overcoat, but we sold 25 tote bags and 150 hats, then we know that we need to drop, you know, the RRP of the overcoat, or move into a slightly lightweight jacket, which is more accessible, and increase maybe the amplified visual language of the bag and the hat. So just making sure that whilst you're thinking creatively and getting these ideas out, you're also preparing your endeavor to be able to be a business that can then scale in a few years. And the sooner you start considering those elements to your creative practice, the easier it will be to kind of grow comfortably and in control of the growth as well.
Nice. Hey, Samuel, Virgil shared a little bit about Off-White, the brand, and, you know, its identity. And for you and A Cold Wall, can you talk a little bit about how you created the brand in terms of its identity and its DNA?
Sure, yeah. I mean, for me, when I first started A Cold Wall, it actually was born of a dissertation that I wrote. And it was around a 2,500 word think piece that I just decided to write. I knew I wanted to start a label after kind of seeing what Virgil had done, seeing what was happening in North America. There was this like swell of the zeitgeist moving forward. A lot of creativity was happening. There was a new place in the market for fashion, contemporary fashion. And then again, I realized I'm from England, I'm from the UK, born in London, now live outside. The narrative that I developed for Cold Wall, for it to be authentic and find a market fit, it needs to have a voice of its own. So I always went into research and development, you could say. The dissertation was the process of trialing out ideas, writing down notes, observing, again, my personal story and what was around me and how that could be interrelated to the wider populace. I found it important, especially in this generation, that the ideas that come forth have a democratic, plural spirit and nature. And that was one of the first, you could say, forms of identity that was built into Cold War. That written piece allowed me to outline the value system of the brand, that being the democratic brand, that being based on class and speaking to all races, though being, heavily influenced by the Black narrative. That also informed the color palette. At that point, I was looking at post-industrial World War II Britain. We're looking at, renovated Victorian buildings. We're looking at, industrial materials, bleached washes. The language came about alongside the, you could say, social value proposition from this think piece. And to kind of bring that forward, that then went into graphics, building out the font bank that was suitable for Cold War, thinking about what materials best reflect these architectural environments which were informed by the dissertation. It all was quite a methodical process, you could say. And again, this just gives you more scope and space to build out a brand ID if you actually put pen to paper on it before kind of picking up the scissors or throwing the paint at the wall. And I'm sure, for Virgil and for Pyrex and Off-White, it was a very similar dichotomy, you could say, of taking one excerpt from X and one excerpt from Y and pulling the two together to make a new vernacular, you could say.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear from a couple of you, like, if with your own label, what does your brand stand for? Just to hear some other voices in the room.
Anybody want to jump in? I know some of you have your own.
Jordan, I think you're on mute. Did you? I could hear someone talking.
Yeah, I hear Miriam.
Yeah. So basically what my brand stands for is, I wanted, I was on a journey where I really didn't love myself, but then I kind of like accepted who I was as a Black Muslim woman. And that really stemmed from like my mother's love. Like she didn't judge me. She didn't crucify me for what I had gone through or whatever. She was just there for me. And she was just like, you can do this, it's one step at a time. So basically my brand is kind of inspired by a mother's love. And it's about, being inclusive to all women, wherever you are in your journey, like as a modest woman or just a woman, period, you can always try to evolve and try to get better because, there is this thing in the Muslim community sometimes where, you have to wear your hijab across your chest, or you have to do this, or you have to do that. My brand is about having a brand that is inclusive to all Muslim women, whether you wear your hijab or whether you don't wear it. It's about, meeting women where they are at their own modest journey. So that's where my brand stems from.
That's awesome. Anyone else? We'll just like a quick rapid, just a few, so we can, because I don't want it just to be me and Samuel telling our story, because of course you might know that I want to hear, this is a group conversation. Anyone else?
I would say that my brand is really about kind of subverting our ideas about masculinity. I'm currently in the midst of like working on my thesis, and I'm really focusing on just really analyzing masculinity and reshaping it without like any like toxic notions and whatnot, and just really making it for everyone, if that makes sense. So I would say that's like kind of like the basis of my brand and where I'm seeking to just continue like building and adding on multiple things to it. So yeah.
That's awesome. Like those are two good ones, and those I would give like great marks for finding the inefficiency sort of in the market. Because if you read Business of Fashion, or if you read like the top line stuff, it's a little bit too broad, right? It's like sustainability.
Well, it lacks it lacks a poignancy, and I think it lacks a layer of reality and distillation. Fashion needs to come back down to kind of projecting and talking about real life matters, and that's how you kind of are able to kind of get in and start amplifying an idea.
Yeah, and that's Samuel said exactly. That's why we work so well. He said exactly what I was thinking. It's like we get frustrated. We're still just like, you always say like stay hungry. We're still just as frustrated as when we started our journey, and that frustration is our momentum, right? When you talk about you know, your experience as a Muslim woman, and, you know, on both sides of the coin, you know, from the community plus the outside world, you're stuck in the middle. And Kadeem, you know, your premise just the same. Like, you're finding an inefficiency in how, like, you know, masculinity is presented even in 2021, and so your brand can be about that. Then once you get sort of creating your collections, your images, if they all tie back to that central point, that's when you start seeing the momentum, right? Because it's engaging and it's not watered down. It's not like, oh, I just want to make clothes, or, oh, I just want to, you know, be in fashion. I want, you know, it's like you have like a very poignant message. So you guys illustrated my point. Very, very good premise. Peter, you want to go to the next talking point?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. One thing that you touched on, Samuel, was just the challenges on the commercial side and making sure that you understand how to get something made and sold and make a margin, and, you know, figuring out supply chain and efficiencies. How do you, if you're coming to this from a more creative place, how do you get that knowledge and expertise, and how does that relate maybe to mentoring and folks out there who you and Virgil have been mentored or been mentored by, and how that's given you that dimension of what you needed and didn't have?
Yeah, completely. I mean, when we kind of started out in the Cold War, we didn't have a product developer in place until year 3. So the first 3 years, it was pretty much spending as much time as possible at, you know, lo-fi local manufacturing hubs, you know, finding out, you know, where some of the more, you know, experienced older generation are kind of running small ateliers and tailoring outlets and shops, and just spending as much time with them as possible. You know, some of my earliest pieces to kind of understand how to make clothes, because I didn't come from fashion, it was product design I came from. I would go and buy clothes from a secondhand store, take them to a tailor's, and spend as much time with the tailor as possible, almost reverse engineering the goods. Once that was understood in terms of, you know, how much fabric and consumption and how many trims and snaps are needed to make, you know, a coat, let's say, or a bag, I then literally go into, well, we don't have over here you call it the yellow pages, it's a big yellow book. You go in it, it's a company directory. At that point, we'd still call to go and find manufacturers to work with. Now you can just go online, but find local manufacturers, spend time with your local tailor, build in those relationships, and they can help pass on skills to do with consumption and production is what I'd really say there. Those are where, you know, you can find local mentors as well as, you know, creative mentors. And I think having that dynamism between the two is really important. Again, to get an idea going commercially, it takes a few people to kind of get you on that journey.
Virgil, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, no, like he pretty much summed it up, you know, like it's a lot of times in fashion when you're starting, you're going to find like you don't have the right factory contact, you don't have the right fabrics, you think, you know, production, like all these like very, very big hurdles. And my approach is always like, you know, if you can get a garment, you know, there's millions of clothes everywhere, you know, like whether or not they're designed or whatever, if you can take that and like going to your local tailor and editing the piece the way that you see fit and going to an embroiderer and making the embroidery there, like that's a perfectly good place to start. Even if you only have one prototype, you know, you can make a dress by going to a vintage store, taking 3 of them, cutting them in half, putting them together, you know. So of course there's a practicality, but there's also just a scrappiness that works. And that's what's possible. So focusing on what's possible and what's at arm's reach, rather than being like, oh, I don't have the resources, because, you know, that's the nature of starting out. We didn't have resources either, and it was our scrappiness that makes us designers today. It's not our resources.
That's where you find almost, you know, the diamond in the rough is in that scrappy iterative process. That process of kind of, you know, taking 2 dresses and putting them together, or taking the overcoat and screen printing the back and seeing the mottled edge from the plastisol ink is how you kind of build and discover these brand signatures through process and through, really it's A/B testing. It's all trial and error, but that process is almost like, the golden mile that one has to walk. For myself, it went from working with these local tailors outside of London to then tailors telling me about, where does everyone buy their fabric? Well, they buy it at Goldhawk Lane in London, in West London. Then you go to Goldhawk Lane and there's 25 fabric shops, and you start your relationships. The fabric shops tell you where to make the clothes, and you go to. It's all kind of part of living through the process to a certain degree.
Yeah, valuable points.
This is the theme is building your brand DNA, and we heard from Mariam and Kadeem with kind of very personal brand missions, or the ethos is really informed by a very personal perspective. But then Samuel, you were really talking about a written manifesto and about detailed brand architecture down to font and color palette. How important is it for people like Mariam and Kadeem to kind of take that personal aesthetic and wrap it in kind of a more specific brand DNA of the sort you described?
Well, firstly, I'd say, Mariam and Kadeem, kudos to having, propositions which actually solve problems. It's going to make your life a lot easier, because you're actually looking at what is missing from the marketplace. What are people asking for? It's going to be easier to kind of quantify and then add that branding in. But the branding element, the visual communication and language is incredibly important. It's about finding a way to build a language that you're comfortable with in terms, and by language, I mean, color, texture, tint, material, almost key signatures and rules. Like if your brand and its values was to take shape as a house, what would that house look like? How many floors would it have? What would the materials be? Where would it be located? What would the temperature be? The same way I can say, well, what would a t-shirt variant of that house be like, which reflects your brand? You should be able to take your idea down and distill it into a single simplified garment. And once you should try that. Take your concept, build it into a t-shirt, build it into a wallet, build it into a hat, build it into an overcoat, and then start identifying where there are, signatures which can be expanded upon. Maybe it's color, again, maybe it's typography, maybe it's the material tint, but almost test yourself, test yourself and try out these ideas, and you'll quickly identify where you need to maybe expand, or maybe where some of the ideas are a bit too heavy and you need to kind of put away as well.
Nice.
That's the golden, like it's kind of both of those two are the critical steps. Like Samuel talking about writing down the manifesto, and it should be like, in my mind, it's like 15 words max.
Yeah, it shouldn't be too heavy.
Like you have to be able to elevator pitch it. And that briefness is about making sure it sticks. I talk a lot. I can do run-on sentences for a day, but I can also in 15 words describe what my brand is about and what my summarize. If anyone, because the only reason why we're giving you these jewels is because someone, in order for it to be quote unquote successful, which can be anything, doesn't mean money, but in order for it to be successful is that someone outside of yourself can understand the litany of ideas in your head. That's always, it's helpful than not. So brief, being able to summarize is key. So 15 words brand. But then when Samuel talked about, and Peter brought up like the typeface, like what's your name? And your name the name of the brand should equally tie back into the brand, what it means. Or it doesn't have to, but you should be able to, in one sentence, get someone's brain to go, aha, I get it. And then the typeface, like what's your logo look like? What's the label look like? What would the garment be? What's the color of the brand? All these sorts of things make great brand architecture. Of course, you can not have them, but if you look at, say, Rick Owens, right? You can feel the typeface, the label, the hang tag, and the store, and that the music in the store, what it would take to feel like. Samuel has that with a cold wall, like the sound, you can hear the sound, you can see the wax label. I know the typography because it's linked to that manifesto and it's linked to his premise. That is great brand architecture that sets you up to win as you're, as you're building brand equity.
And also, just to add on there, that's not like almost like the best part of this is once you've got that architecture in place, is how do you go about bringing in brand impact? What's the pendulum swing and rhythm of your brand? And that's, how does your brand take shape in terms of installation? When you're thinking about a runway show, what do you want the first thing to be felt when someone sees that first look come out onto the stage? All of these elements are super, super, super exciting, but also really quite key to making sure that when someone is first exposed to the first image or video clip of your brand, that you're communicating exactly what you want them to achieve. It shouldn't be that, when you show a garment that it's just a garment. No. We want a universe around it. And that doesn't necessarily mean physical universe. It can be down to the casting that you choose, down to the height of the models, down to the cadence of the walk, down to the site location, even if it's like a bombarded show that you decided to kind of run in the middle of downtown. All of these elements should kind of link back to your manifesto and take shape in physical form. And as Vinny also said, a huge part of this I've had to learn as well is not saying or writing too much, but showing it. And building a world, or building these micro elements which then add up to a world to convey what your brand has to say. That could be down to a bright orange piece of card which has like a shiny coating on it, which is your swing tag, which is also your invite. All of these little moments even, or instances, it's almost this pendulum swing between macro, explosive moments of creativity, but also micro, insular moments of detail existing under one umbrella. And that umbrella is, of course, your brand world.
Nice. One last thought, and then I'll let Virgil, you open it up to, I know there's some other brand builders and entrepreneurs among our 20, but we talked about traditional and non-traditional. We've got 20 scholars who are in school pursuing a course of study, but both of you have had kind of disparate experiences that led you to be brand builders. You Samuel, you were a street artist, graphic designer, videographer. What advice do you give to our scholars about how to, maybe you're pursuing a path, but you can pivot, you can be nimble, you can explore different directions, and that all can lead you to where you two find yourselves. I mean, maybe a little bit about that journey for you and how that would be one that folks could relate to.
Sure. Yeah, I think the agility to kind of jump between different disciplines, but not necessarily be an expert in every single discipline when you're starting out, is just a really key way to move as quickly as possible and scale up these different elements of your brand. And this kind of goes back and it touches back a little bit to the manifesto dialogue about, okay, what is the exoskeleton of a brand? And then how do you operate in each of those different sectors? And of course, starting out, we all know you're going to need to rely on yourself. So how can you fulfill those requirements to a certain level, at least to kind of get things moving? Ideally, you are going to be the vanguards, for your brand forever. So you've got to be thinking in 5 years, when you guys are all ready to start building out a wider team of say 10 to 15 people, they're going to come to you to kind of be expecting all the answers on typography, merchandising, market fit, color swatches, fabrications, size of collection, music for collection, lighting. This is almost the perfect time when you're incubating your concept to be a brand, to really start to get to grips with all of those relevant disciplines, and again, that's photography, that's videography, that's Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, Java Suite, Squarespace, all of these programs, to be honest, which exist within Adobe Suite and Adobe Cloud, are what you need to be propagating now, just to build out that wider understanding of your brand.
Nice. Hey, Virgil, I think maybe we want to open it up now. It's been 40 minutes. You might want to just to connect with a few other of the scholars and get a little bit more engagement.
Yeah, I'd like to hear, based on what was sort of presented, this very specific like brand architecture, finding the inefficiency. Do you have, does anything that we've said spark sort of interest or more clarity that you want? I'm glad that these are smaller rooms, so we can get to some. But if anyone has anything specific that you want us to clarify, how it could relate to your business and your trajectory.
Well, my name's Divine. I think like personally for me in this time, I'm really, really grateful for this conversation because I feel like for probably a couple days, maybe a week, I've been so like lost and kind of just like feel like I had a good direction that I was going in with my brand. And then I feel like sometimes you kind of lose sight of where you want it to go, where things just don't fall into place the same way that you kind of expected. So everything that you guys said in this Zoom was literally very inspiring and kind of like it's kind of helping me kind of try to get back on track, and it's everything that I kind of needed to hear as well. I feel like my question to you guys would probably be for someone who feels like they have kind of like lost sight or like the direction that they kind of wanted to go in, how do you kind of get back on track or maybe start over? When you said, some people kind of lose their way by trying to get poppin'. That's never my intention. But when you said, I was like, oh, well, actually, maybe that's what I was doing unintentionally. So my question is like, for people that do kind of lose track and lose sight of their vision, how do you get back on track or kind of reground yourself and reshape what you had originally planned?
Yeah, I'll go and then let Samuel add on. You just hit on like I keep forgetting, but this is bar none, one of my best pieces of advice, period, is that the best gift of being early in your career is that you can completely take everything that you've done, roll it up in a ball and throw it in the trash. Like, I swear, it doesn't seem like a gift. It's the biggest gift on planet Earth. Because what happens is you start an idea and you start telling a friend about it, right? Then you change your Instagram bio, like creative director of said brand name. And then you're like, you meet a few people around town and you're like, oh, this is my brand. This is what I do. So like 3 days from that original start of changing Instagram bio, you feel like you can't change. You feel like if you do, then everyone thinks that you failed and then the brand doesn't exist and yada, yada, yada. And I swear, like from a brand name, so many times I meet people that like they've evolved from the name that they've started. And it's like, just throw the name away and come up with a new one, or your brand premise, or, so if you thought that, you wanted to do streetwear one day and then you're like, wait, I'm seeing too many streetwear things. I haven't even launched, I'm going to switch it up and I'm going to go couture or tailoring, or I saw a film and that inspired me. Like, screw that. Like, there's no fault. And it's actually your greatest power. And just a last little piece, like a piece of advice that I got on a business sense. So take creativity away from it. Just when my first business like had like a shady business partner and it like imploded and it was like super emotional and you're kind of like, wait, there's money involved and it was a creative thing. Someone gave me the piece of advice. He's like, hey, don't you know everyone's first business fails? And that lifted a weight off my shoulder because I was thinking like, oh, my first business is going to pay for my whole family. I'm going to build like the first invoice. You start thinking that that's your road to be like your, anyone successful, and it's like your life has to go down. So that's my two pieces of advice, both on the creative side. It's temporary. Use that to fuel the next. And on the business side, don't be shocked. Don't get thrown back by that happening. Sam, any experience on that end?
Yeah, I mean, it's like music to my ears on your point. And also, Divine, the point you made is like, it's the perfect thing to hear for where you're at in your career. Like, Virgil, you probably remember when I first started working for you, I had a different clothing brand, which was not a Cold War, which was called 24, written in this really abstract, cryptic way. And I was like 21, and Divine, I was probably at a similar place you were at. And I was like, is this working? I like it, but maybe I'm being too insular. And I just dropped it and started again, and went back in and learned from that and build something up, which kind of made a lot more sense to market. And I've just jotted down a really quick note on this. Sometimes if you feel like you're losing your way with your brand, it's good to kind of check the manifesto against like reality and what's actually happening, because sometimes the manifesto can be outdated and you just need to update it and then go back into market as well. You can be trying to talk about one thing, but potentially there are pockets culturally, right? And if you don't hit that first pocket, maybe you need to just re-articulate what you're trying to achieve and then try and hit the second pocket or locate a different area to work within. And by that, I mean, if it's not, let's say if couture is not working, maybe there's a gap in the market for, high-end leather bags made from sustainable materials. And that's probably where the zeitgeist is. And that would be the most, pragmatic place to operate in. It's kind of mediating creativity and understanding when it's okay to reset an idea and recultivate it. And also understanding like the business dynamic and looking at where there are pockets in market as well. It's probably the easiest way. So you're doing like a left brain and a right brain assessment on it.
Yeah. And just lastly, before we go to the next one, like, read fashion I don't read anything, but that's sort of but read interviews, read the New York Times fashion section, read business of fashion headlines, and sort of use that. At least, it's great to sort of just know like what are the top line things in the industry. And if you tailor, obviously do what is authentic to you, but you're sort of noticing that, like Sam said, like sustainable leather bags, like that's a great concept because everyone wants to do ready to wear, which is bags, shoes, earrings, runway shows. We Samuel and I were 8 years ago at the front of like not many Black designers at the end of the runway articulating full brand vision, which is a whole different task than making a successful career. Before that, it was, I remember like a Kate Spade bags were amazing, culturally poignant for that thing, or, earrings from such and such jewelry designer. So it's like accessories, hats, like sneakers. You could just be a sneaker designer, or dresses. I just find that's a good piece of advice for like, sometimes you can just take on the idea of being Ralph Lauren out the gate. And Samuel and I did that.
Yeah, we kind of, now we both have no hair because
no hair, gray. What hair is left is turning gray for sure.
This idea of like, specialization is super, super important. Almost specialization being VS the omnist is really exciting. It's like, do you build a vertical business, which is say 1 or 2 product categories, and they're hyper successful when everyone knows you just for that, and you build up a signature just around that universe? Or do you go horizontal and kind of try like a potluck game where you're covering like 12 to 14 different categories and seeing what sticks? And both are valid, but it's the perfect time to be trialing out now while you're questioning your brand's perspective.
Next question. Anyone have anything that sticks out?
I have a question. Hi, my name is Desiree Smith. I'm a junior industrial design major, so I don't really have a brand, so to say, but I was just very interested in how to navigate a conservative industry such as like product design and industrial design, especially since that industry is something that rejects fashion, because I guess what I do want to do in terms of like my career goals is I'm very interested in using those engineered materials that we get to work with in industrial design and being able to make prototypes and do those things so that they can become more commodity materials that can actually be applicable in fashion. And I think it's just really hard to find like a firm or a fashion brand that is like willing to do that, because it does combine those things in a very weird way.
I'll start, but I think your what makes you unique is gonna be what makes you stand out. Like, and that's the case for everyone. Like what seemingly doesn't make sense is going to be what's going to propel you forward. Like Samuel and I know can attest to, like, a part of our practice is to get better at industrial design, almost more than just fashion, because that's hard to get brand DNA into a zipper pull, right? You know, into a shoe. A shoe is, to me, is industrial design. A handbag to me is industrial design. So you have like a unique advantage where you could probably benefit every other brand in this chat, because that small form factor in materiality and in shape needs an expert or a consultant. You know, every fashion house has someone that does specifically what you do. And so, you know, I think it might be just how you present your project. Like if your Instagram or website was like, hey, I consult for fashion brands and I develop A, B, C, D, trims, custom, you know, 3D rendering programs to focus on shoes, bags, and hardware. Like there isn't a designer that's like, you know, I do that every day. And Sam, you could speak to what you think about her premise.
Yeah, I think that like the beauty of this is, the reality is that your space is to work within both industries. You need to work simultaneously within fashion and within industrial design, and kind of almost like juggle the two concurrently to kind of find the space to connect them. As Virgil said, in terms of like, you know, practicality, there's so much tooling throughout fashion which requires the expertise of the industrial design side of development, you could say. But there's not necessarily a group of designers that are really recognized for being specialists in industrial design interlinking into fashion. You have industrial designers from like the older generation kind of segueing in, but no one's really owned that space. And that's probably part of, you know, what is going to be the future tense of fashion and industrial design, if we're talking about sustainable materials coming forth as well, and engineering. And from my personal experience, you know, when I first started working with Virgil, I was a product designer working at a industrial design company, whilst also, you know, working with Virgil in fashion. And there was this segue between the two, which even now has come back to inform the way that I kind of develop products. It's all come from industrial design. So your perspective here is completely valid in fashion. It's using that as a strength actually to brand yourself and build in a brand ID off of that background.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Cool. Anyone else?
I have a question. Hi, I'm Adele. I'm trying to navigate starting something, and I'm kind of wondering where the intersection of feasibility and authenticity are. Because when I'm thinking about it, like right now, I don't have a lot of resources, but if I want to start something new, like how should I go about doing that when I know that people who might want to buy it are like me and might not be willing to drop a ton of money on something? So that means I can't afford to spend like days and hours making something. So I'm kind of wondering like how I can open up my range to a consumer. And then also if there was like one thing I could invest in to hit the ground running, what might it be?
I'd probably say brand identity. So building your brand universe can exist outside of a product, right? It's about how do you build up that visual language, color palette, vernacular, tone, cadence, voice, typographic, color. How can all of that be almost built separate to any object or article or garment? And it's more so about finding a way to apply what you built as a manifesto, a visual manifesto in this instance, onto those different articles to offset costing. You know, for V and I, we started on t-shirts, but now if we were looking to, you know, probably step into the space of where you are, there might be a better opportunity in like small level goods, which can still be produced for quite cheap, but maybe, you know, $12 a unit or whatnot. It's really about how do you kind of find that way to not necessarily compromise where you want to sit in market by utilizing entry accessories, which can still harbor and carry good craftsmanship without kind of blowing out the bank is what I'd say. Like there's no pressure to kind of go in with a full overcoat or with a, you know, like a trench coat or parka. It can start as small as, you know, a key ring or a lanyard or a very small pouch bag, and then you can start to scale that story as there's continued success in those early starting categories.
Thanks, Samuel. Anybody else have some questions?
I do. I just have a question about just kind of getting the word out there about your brand, because that's something that, especially in this time, because that's something that I've always really struggled with. Because I would do like photo shoot, I would finish like a collection, I would do photo shoots and post about it, and then that would be like the end of it. And you know, I really want to like have a brand that's like visible and like is continuously like ascending. So what would be your advice for like just getting the word out there about it, marketing and whatnot?
Yeah, Sam, what's your thought about, like, because marketing when we started was different than today, for sure. Do you have any vibes?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'd probably look at, because I completely empathize with what you're saying, Kadeem. You know, there's often times you can kind of pour everything in to digital assets. Digital assets go out and then they kind of fall into the, you know, the black hole or slipstream of social media. I think the best way to kind of fortify and protect your brand ID and value is actually to focus on the offline and let it naturally filter online. So yes, that there should be a brand, you know, a brand page there, which is posting up content in a very static manner and stable manner, but actually you want hyperactivity happening offline in local community. That might mean, you know, democratizing the goods that you give to people, such as your, you know, you might have a merch t-shirt, let's say, or a cap or a hat or a very entry-level canvas bag, which you can then seed out to people within your community to start building an organic groundswell. You know, there's one brand which comes to mind, which has done this really well, which is a new brand from London. It's called Courtiers, rules the world, and it's a private Instagram page. You know, their goods sell out instantaneously every drop and have done for the past year, and it's completely anti-establishment. No hypebeast coverage, no high Savati, no Vogue, no GQ, no WWD, and it's, you know, the highest heat contemporary zeitgeist brand in London at the moment, because he's focused solely on community consistently. And he's built a really organic, loyal following through small activations, through seeding the right people continuously. It takes some time to get momentum going, but it always kind of starts at the community base. And you want it to start a community because we all know how top line fashion can be. It goes through trends and ebbs and flows of what is you know, deemed viable to speak about. Whereas if you have the community in place, you're literally safeguarding your business and you're safeguarding your cultural equity as well.
Yeah, and I think the best is like with each sort of year, it becomes different to get a brand off, different language to get a brand off the ground. Like, you know, because the market gets flooded with whatever the previous good idea is. It could be, you just kind of have to think on your toes, really, you know, and that will lead to sort of your own format. You know, it's got to be engagement, right? Like that's the other way to look at sort of like getting more traction or notoriety. And so, you know, if it's doing pop-ups, collaborations, or doing a flash mob runway show in your local space or something, like it's turned into sort of an idea factory. So you either have to, as Samuel's saying, go off the grid or on the grid, or some version of in between. You know, and that's kind of like how you start to sort of make those inroads.
And the last note I'd probably just add on before we close is anything that you produce in that vernacular should be high impact. If it doesn't give you like a slightly worried feeling about producing the work, it should be doing that. You should feel like you're kind of pushing the nodes of creativity forward. But when you're thinking about these, you know, guerrilla marketing moments or whatnot, it should move things forward. And if that's the case, the value proposition will be seen.
Kehlani, did you have a question?
So much for the, oh, sorry.
All right, Kadeem, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say thank you for the advice.
No worries, man.
Stellar.
I did actually. My question was more about what you were talking about, commercializing your creativity. Me personally, like my brand identity has always come from like me being a kid. Even now, like I'm a foot taller than the average woman, so my brand and like my creativity has always stemmed from that, and like trying to figure out how to bring that into like my personal brand and like still have that like foundation of like that's what's inspired me, because I know like that's not the same for 90% of the people I meet, that they don't struggle with that, like finding clothes for their height or their body or something, but still wanting to have that like aspect within it.
Yeah. Say that again.
Excuse me?
From my end, it cut out, but maybe you missed it. Or Sam, did you hear the question?
Yeah, I heard the question is how do you build how do you kind of personify your own identity and that unique perspective into the identity of your brand without potentially shortening the scope of where your brand can go. And I think at that point, Kalani, it's more so looking at how can your identity almost be the keystone of your brand. Like it could be that there are particular looks that occur within the show that really exemplify and exaggerate that talking point and that focal point of the brand, which still signals to market, this is, the ethos, the value system behind the identity of the brand. This is who the brand also caters for commercially without necessarily singling out the rest of the market. So it's more so extending your SKU sizes to like extra tall, extra high or whatnot, to then cover that segment of the market whilst also covering the standard heights applicable in market. There are ways you can build that into almost being like the canon or muse within a show. For example, if you think about a recurring show, there are always particular identities, people, or typologies within the show which convey more than just the clothes, but actually convey the designer's presence, you could say. And there's no reason why you can't carry that type of treatment or application across into your own brand. The two can exist.
And definitely, I think that you're starting in a point where like fashion shows as we see them now are sort of they're an evolution of fashion shows since the beginning, right? And I think that conversation is almost more powerful than a fashion show in itself. And I think a lot of people leave off the opportunity to be very direct and literal. So it would be awesome to hear you saying, as you just told us, your brand premise. It would be awesome to see the runway looks and hearing your voice communicate that. Do you know what I mean? It's like fashion made it so that you have to sort of go in this format to articulate an idea. And our generation, we've basically taken the thread off of that and said, hey, this is a way to communicate that, because it's immediately engaging. Your entry point and reasoning why. And so often, if you put it in the ecosystem of a bunch of formats that sort of wash away the story, it makes it harder to sort of like be known for the exact story. And I think that it's something that you should wear on your sleeve. Mm-hmm. And that has an immediate way of engaging. And what you'll find is it'll be a magnet for those that feel the same way to seek out your brand.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Should we wrap?
Yeah, I want to be mindful of your time, Virgil, and yours, Samuel. And thanks everybody for tuning in. But thank you in particular, Samuel and Virgil, for sharing what you shared. It was, I found it incredibly insightful and helpful, and I know you all did. So I just look forward to more of these, Virgil. So thanks for this one, and thanks, Samuel, for everything you shared. And we're gonna do this again very soon, and you'll be hearing from me and Marie very directly, each of you scholars, very shortly.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thanks for your time, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Take care.
Take care, guys. Bye.
All right. Thanks.
everyone.
Thank you.